Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on relationships at work, the Fruit for Thought series by the Oranges Toolkit. My name is Tegan Davies, and I'm going to host an incredible conversation with the wonderful Elizabeth Shaw today, the CEO of Relationships Australia, New South Wales. Elizabeth is a clinical and counselling psychologist. She has a love of relationships, and those loves of relationships has led her to postgraduate teaching, consulting, and she's written a number of publications, if I can speak today, on all things relationships. So welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you for dialing in today. We've only got half an hour, and we're going to jam-pack half an hour pretty solidly. I'm curious to understand, in many of our workshops, what we hear a lot of people talk about is the fact that sometimes there's conflict at work, and sometimes people are a little bit quick to anger or quick to temper at the moment, mainly because I think what's happened in the past couple of years. But I'm curious to understand, is that your experience? Are you hearing that on the ground as well, that people are maybe a little bit quicker to temper than usual?
Look, I think we are absolutely not only hearing this, but experiencing it ourselves. It's we just developed shorter ropes during COVID, I think. And as people came back to work from the online environment, I think many workplaces, it almost looked like some people had lost their social skills altogether. There was, a real scratchiness. And I think being alone a lot, you can really enjoy that. You can miss people, but you can also forget that there's a lot of work that goes into good relationships, and a lot of that good work is, it's hard work, but it's positive work, and there's a lot of pleasure in it. But it does actually involve a certain amount of deliberate action, particularly in the workplace. So we certainly, I think, have all experienced a sense of irritation and much more alertness to the problem of other people. We're much better at identifying the problem of other people than perhaps the problems in ourselves.
Oh, wow, that was a hard-hitting moment to start with, Elizabeth. So you're trying to tell me I'm not a great self-reflector and it's not everyone else's fault, these relationship challenges?
Oh, well, look, I think there's a lot more research in terms of ethical deliberation that tells us that we're much better at ultimately working out whatever our actions were. They tended to be noble, well-intentioned, and really we did our best. But how other people do things is we don't have such a positive view of other people's good intentions and good actions. So, I think there is some science behind this, but I also think that when we're stressed by the people in our lives, we do a lot of talking about that with our close friends and close others and say, you never guess what they've done now, or gee, they're really getting me down. Our narrative is often very saturated with the problem of other people, and those around us comfort us by saying, yeah, they sound really difficult. That's really hard. We don't always have people say, well, what's your part in that? Even though, we nearly always play a part in some sort of difficult interaction. In fact, even just as soon as we're triggered or affected by another, the ball is in play between us, because our very reactivity, even if it's a reactivity to injustice or unpleasantness, means that, the conversation or the interaction is entirely interpersonal. So trying to objectify the problem of the other as if they're just siloed over there, nothing to do with us, is in itself going to stop good problem solving.
Yeah, really interesting, Elizabeth. And so if we're thinking about good problem solving, what are some things that we can do to set us up for success? What are the foundations of a really strong, positive relationship, whether that's at work or even outside of work?
Well, look, I would start with the thing that you can most control, which is yourself. Even though you're very caught up in the distress often about the interaction with the other, the empowerment comes through really looking at what is the charge in this for me? What is it that's getting me down, that makes me react to this, that makes me upset about this? that makes me feel that this interaction curbs my own options and choices, to get really clear about that. And sometimes saying, oh, look, this sort of person is always my trigger person, or this person reminds me of my mother, or whatever it might be. It's not to say that there's a full stop. As soon as you've worked that out, that's the end of it. But it's more saying, okay, if I've got a bit more self-knowledge, a bit more understanding of why this is bothering me, you can start to think, well, what have I done in the past? What do I usually do to get myself through this? And, you know, you start to see yourself as someone who might have some resources, and sometimes if you get why this situation is bugging you, you can even feel a little bit more compassionate towards it, or even sort of calm down a bit, because you think, well, the first thing I need to do is work out a way to take out the emotional charge so that I can think straight. Secondly, I think to try and really work out what is it about the situation, like really nailing the nature of the problem. So you might be at the moment thinking, oh, I just hate those meetings, or I hate, you know, that particular group of people, or I'm hating this project. To try and really nail, well, why exactly is that? Sometimes in our distress, again, we go to global narratives that don't give us the chance to problem solve effectively, because we're not nailing the particulars. Sometimes nailing the particulars means that you think, okay, well, there's actually one component I could start to experiment with or do differently straight away, and I could just see how that goes. So I think trying to really sort of pin that down. It's also worth thinking about, you know, is the problem interaction partly because the relationship wasn't set up well in the first place, or where the environment is setting you up. So just say, for example, you're asked to engage in a project, and the whole terms of reference and the roles and responsibilities, and you know, the whole project was set up in a wonky way to start with. Even realizing, look, maybe all the participants in this, we might all be struggling, or we might all be sort of set up for this problem, and it's actually not our fault. Even that can start to open up your point of reference and start to say, well, maybe I could go to others and say, look, I'm struggling with these arrangements. Are you struggling? You know, because maybe there's something we could stop and talk about that brings you onto the same page around problem solving. So I think, if anything, slow down, some self-reflection and some analysis will in fact improve your options and the opportunities, and then you can plan your action.
Yeah, and I think that many people would be like, oh, that's easier said than done, because I've got my workload at the moment is intense. The kids at home are intense. I'm juggling this and I'm that. And that comes back to maybe the point around why we're a little bit quick to anger at the moment, or quick to temper, because we haven't had that opportunity of slowing down and self-reflecting and thinking about the way or how we play or what we play in the relationships that we have. When you were talking,
sorry, go on.
Go for it.
No, I was just going to say the thing though that we do need to remember is that we can be remarkably, you know, once that starts, we can be remarkably tolerant of going over and over and over a problem. And we actually can talk to our friends and family and colleagues about it. But also our narrative is, I'm too busy to tackle this, or I'm too busy to make change. But we're actually using a lot of time on rumination and reflection. So just on that, I agree, you know, the scratchiness is often, can everyone just get out of my way? Because if you leave me to it, I've got this covered. But I think, in fact, we use all this false labour, including that dreadful 3 a.m. time where all these people are living in our heads and wearing us down. And that is actually adding to the scratchiness too, is carrying around unsolved problems that if we just stop for 10 minutes and gave it a little bit more reflection, we might be able to take one of those boiling pots off the stove.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, the old 3 a.m. chestnut. Were you in my dreams last night, Elizabeth? Um,
Oh, it's so annoying, isn't it? It's such a waste of time, and then you get angry because you're wasting time. And but it's so often people that are in our heads. I mean, of course, you can wake up and think, "How am I ever going to get that project done or that task?" But most of the time, I think people listening to this will be saying, "Yeah, it's that irritating person that's in my head, or the feeling that my boss is out to get me, or my colleagues hate me, or what's the board going to do," or whatever it is. It's often people at the other end of these negative ruminations.
Lovely. I heard someone say the other day, we want to try to reflect rather than ruminate. And I just thought that was a lovely term of phrase of like, yes, we want to reflect, but actually try not to end up getting ourselves in that sort of negative head spiral. One of the sayings that I personally really resonate with when I'm triggered by someone is, because when we're triggered by someone, or maybe we're triggered by someone's behavior is probably a better way to describe it. When I notice that judgment, I ask myself, what am I learning in this moment? Because that takes me from judgment to curiosity. And I notice I soften and I'm less spiky towards that person. So I think sometimes phrases can be really helpful for people to have in their head as reminders to think, okay, maybe there's nothing wrong with that person. They're just different. Maybe they've got different values, different needs. Maybe they've got unmet needs as well. That's something that I found helpful for my own experience. So let's say we are in the moment of frustration where we feel like things are getting a little bit out of hand. Are there any practical tips and tools that we can kind of take the pot off the stove, as you said, to kind of simmer that down in that moment for ourselves, but also for the other person as well?
Look, I think odds are on, not always the case, but often it's the case that if you're feeling a bit charged by the interaction, the other person may well be too. And even just realising that can give you a point of connection. And to think, well, we're in this together. If it's not working out for me, it can't really be working out entirely for the other person either. So, notwithstanding what I said to start with, which is most productive to try and take the emotional charge out of it and not react in the moment, but to just work something out a bit. Not for too long, but, if you spend weeks doing that, you've missed your opportunity. But I think if you can know yourself well enough to know what the issue is, often what can be good is going to the person. This is quite courageous, but going to the person and saying, look, there's something I want to discuss. Have you got half an hour in your diary? So don't spring it on them in the corridor or just turn up in their doorway. If you have a doorway, I'm in open plan. Don't appear by their desk, but just say, look, I just want to nut something out with you a bit, make it a sort of a friendly, there's just some thoughts I'm having, I just want to share with you. And it can be very useful to say, look, I'm not really enjoying those meetings, or I think you and I got off on the wrong foot. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've certainly noticed. So you kind of invite them into, it's okay if you've noticed because I've noticed, and if they say, no, I haven't noticed anything, you can say, well, good, I'm glad about that. But look, I'm just having an experience about this and I just want to clear the air or just want to think it through with you because it would really help me out. So I think there's a lot about just trying to be clear. Look, I wanted to talk about it with you because it's kind of blocking what I think could be a more productive arrangement, or it actually would just get something straight in my own mind, or I think you and I could get on better if we did A, B, or C. If you actually talk about it as something that you see has a productive outcome and is a well-intentioned outcome and that you want the best for both of you, then it's a much smaller target conversation than saying, I have an issue with you. Although it might come to that, it certainly might, because this might be your warm-up checkout to see if there's any movement in this relationship or not. Now, these sorts of things are good things to do at home too, is just to reflect on your own part in the problem. What might I be doing that set this event in train? How can I be ready to own up to that? Because that also offers good leadership. Because you could say, look, I think I've been probably coming across in this particular way, and I've been reflecting on that, and I wanted to talk to you about that. I mean, what a lovely gift for the other person to also perhaps say, well, yes, I've noticed that, or yes, I've done that too. And I see there's a comment, I've tried this with a colleague, none of these things are surefire ways to work. All we can do is start off at this scale and see what it offers us. If it doesn't offer us, it's a piece of information, okay, that didn't work on the face of it because you didn't leave the meeting with everybody feeling much more connected. But sometimes you don't know what impact it's had to just show you're on for a conversation. So in that moment, perhaps it didn't have a good outcome, but what it has done is showed some leadership and championing the possibility of conversations. And the proof will really be if after that conversation, things are better in that next meeting or in that next interaction. Now, if they're not, and in that example just given, the other person doesn't reflect, then to know that the power that you've got is in what you offer the relationship, to know that you can control whether you overwork, underwork, whether you present as grumpy, disrespectful, clocked off, overengaged, you can still control to a degree 50% of the interaction by how you participate, and you can keep looking for opportunities to shape the relationship so that it works out more your way. But of course, sometimes relationships have broken down, and the best thing you can do is avoid close contact with that person or minimize it. I think that's where a lot of people have probably valued the hybrid work environment, because if your colleagues, if the dynamics in the office aren't great, what it does is it helps us moderate that by being online sometimes. The downside of that is sometimes that stops us building good relationships, because you can think, I don't care enough about this, I don't have to see you tomorrow. And then we don't bother to do the work to deepen the relationship. So it both works for us and against us.
Oh my goodness, Elizabeth, I'm so glad we're recording this, because I need to come back to that little segment there and rewatch you over and over again. I think that most of us would like an Elizabeth Shaw in our pockets. Next time we have conflict, there was so much gold nugget. And to the person who responded and asked that question, I'm sure that there were a lot of other people who were wanting to ask that question. So thank you. I do have a question at the start of when you were talking a moment ago, you were talking about the importance of having courage to be able to like lean into that discomfort of a difficult conversation. And they are difficult for a reason. Do you have any tips on how people could bring courage, or how they could use some courage, or anything to help us to get into that?
Look, I think that is really important to have that courage. I'm aware that in the chat, it was just an interesting exchange that I just saw coming through that perhaps it's worth me talking about, which I think relates to that seizing of courage. And it's very much about, when, I think, to summarise, when is emotion sort of valid in the workplace, and is there too much focus on emotion? And I think that's that's a whole topic in itself. It's so interesting because we are in a community now where we are valuing people bringing their whole self to work, and where mental health issues, the whole community has struggled with this. And in organisations, we are having conversations about, well, what do we want to know in the workplace or not? And so I think it is a very interesting conversation. The only reason I'm talking about emotion is really as a diagnostic tool. It is not about indulging emotion or in indulging someone else's emotions. It's about just when you're feeling very charged, you might feel very tense or upset or tearful or furious. Those are just the beginning of a diagnostic process to say, well, why do I feel like that? What is that telling me about the nature of the situation, so that you can move to a wise mind and plan your action. It's not to say that you should use your emotion as entirely valid, frankly, because it might be your own stuff. You might be upset because of something going on in your own life, or because they do remind you of this or that. You just need to know that to screen it out, because in work, it's not the place to run on emotion. But I do think there's various comments about emotional intelligence. I think we all know that people who have poor relationship skills, poor self-reflection or insight, they are going to be the trickier candidates at work. And I think increasingly employers are using those as screening criteria for employment, because we all know that technical skills can be learnt. Emotional intelligence is much harder to build in the workplace, so we should use it more often as employment criteria. To your point, Tegan, about courageous conversations, I think this is all about, again, looking at ourselves and our willingness to build robust relationships. And we know that the best of relationships are not just about playing happy families. It's the easiest thing to go around giving your team compliments and to have parties and celebrate, and not enough workplaces do that, but it's actually the easier thing to do. Sometimes, I'm sure you might have noticed this, I've noticed this, sometimes you've got a difficult team member and everybody seems to celebrate them. I don't know if I've seen the most difficult person get all the staff awards, be Employee of the Year. And sometimes this is actually a way everybody manages a difficult interaction by trying to sort of take the prickles out of them by giving them lots of affirmation. This is an example of not being courageous enough to talk to people directly about how they're coming across. It is very, very brave to do this. The way that I comfort myself through it, and I've had lots of crash and burn moments, so don't in any way think, I've got the winning criteria, but I have learnt through many bitter experiences that it's incredibly unkind not to speak to people about their poor behaviour. The thing that annoys me, it's probably in my top 3 things that annoy me and upset me, is when I have someone come to me and say, oh, we're in the final stages of performance action. And I say, and how long has this been going on? Oh, about 3 years. And this is the behaviour that we're managing, and the person seems resistant to change. And I say, well, how long has this been managed? And I've done a lot of executive coaching over my career. I had my own business and I did this, and every narrative started with this difficult person and how long it had been going on. And what I often think when I hear that is I feel really sad for the person that is being talked about, because that person, in the first couple of months of this behaviour exposing itself, usually I hear a story of everybody stepped back and gave them more room. Everybody thought, oh, yuck, I'm staying away from them, or I'm giving them a staff award to try and affirm them out of the bad behaviour, which never works, I might say. And I just think if someone moved in and said, look, you may not mean it, but the way you're coming across is not going to work for you in this workplace, or you're really upsetting people. I just want to give you the heads up. If everybody had moved in and been straight with this person, maybe they would have learnt and pulled their head in and either left the organisation to all of our relief, or they may have grown and changed and developed. So I think when you picture the people that you're most struggling with, really think about how long have they been in the organisation and how has the system enabled this behaviour to continue. And that is a lack of courage. It's a lack of courage. These people are moved around the organisation because no one wants to deal with them. The trouble is, if you're in that situation, and again, I've had this moment so many times where you're the one who says, okay, I'll deal with it. And then the person can say, I've never had this problem in my whole career. It's obviously your problem because you're the only one who's ever raised this with me. And usually what I say back, and again, this is just one thing to try, is I usually say, I'm so sorry that you've been let down, that no one's talked to you about this, because, it is an issue. That's one thing I do. Or sometimes I do say, well, even if it is just about me, it's an issue right now and it is something to be dealt with. So I see some comments, some of that's resonating with people about these things that have been allowed to run on. And really that's a lack of courage in organisations. I do think what we need to do, and there's again some research on this, is that people will avoid speaking up if they don't feel they've got line management support. So what are we doing throughout an organisation to back our people, and have we given them good tools to use? Because when people don't have confidence in the tools, or they feel there's no organisational commitment, then they're going to think, oh, well, I'll just have to put up with this. But then you actually become sort of part of the problem, co-opted into an anti-growth arrangement. You're working in an anti-growth system. So, that's quite a complex problem and probably outside what we can achieve today, but it's, it's a lot to change.
Yeah, and when you were talking, I was reminded about the importance of psychological safety, and that when we do speak up about someone else's behaviour, we feel like we are supported. And in the development of our training workshop, I came across a really interesting concept about psychological safety isn't about being nice. Yes, it's important to be nice to everyone, and kind and generous and compassionate. And what we want to try to do is actually increase intellectual friction, but decrease social friction. And it was a real aha moment to me of like, we actually want people to think differently, because every organization wants to be innovative and creative and solve problems. But actually we don't want that prickliness that comes with some of the relationships, and having that courage when it hasn't been systematically there, I think would be incredibly difficult for many people. If anyone does have any particular questions, you're welcome to send them through. We've got a couple of minutes to go, but while people may or may not be asking questions, if you were to give one piece of advice to someone around relationships in the workplace, what would be the absolute gold nugget that you would want everyone on this webinar today to walk away with?
Look, I think what I've found very grounding in myself when I've got a lot of noise in my head is to come back to what I stand for. And I think it can be very grounding to say, what is it that, how can I be my best self in this context? And what values do I want to lead with? And if, for example, and most of us immediately again attribute lovely things to ourselves. So I want to have integrity, and I want to be kind, and all of these things. So that's good, but to try and stop and really own them. So how would I lead with kindness in this situation? How can I feel both disappointed in the workplace and still be a person who carries myself with optimism and integrity? How do I do this and not lose myself in the arrangement? That's a very empowering thought, because it is, and it's very grounding, because you think, well, I don't know what I can do about anybody else, but tomorrow I can show up and I can proceed as, in trying to just offer what I can offer, and people will join with me or not. And that can be very settling, I think. I think it's also just to remember that growth comes through a certain amount of disruption. What we do want is, there's going to be friction in any growth moment. If you think of any coach you've ever had, any partner you've had, the time your mother told you off, there's pivotal moments in our development where often, the transition wasn't easy. We got that tricky performance appraisal, or somebody called us out, and it was a bit shaming and a bit difficult. And but that's where growth happens. So friction is part of the deal. So I think even some, trouble can be part of growth. What we don't want is things like someone feeling dismissed, disrespected, insulted. But are they challenged? Yes, if they walk away feeling a bit unnerved, a bit on the edge of their seat, as long as that growth and the emotional content in that is tolerable, that's the moment where we're going somewhere more exciting. If everybody is feeling calm, settled, comforted and soothed, they're also, we all want those from time to time, but there's not necessarily any growth in it. So don't be afraid of being unsettled. That's quite different to being disrespected, for example.
Oh, what a beautiful way to end our 30 minutes of power, Elizabeth. So hopefully people have had some extra tips and tools in their toolkit. We'll provide the recording after this session again so you can watch it all back. But I really love and resonate with this idea that discomfort is a part of growth, and that we actually want that in order for us to personally grow and have our own self-development journey as well. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your time, and thank you for everyone contributing in the chat. We'll see you next time for another series. But yeah, we hope you've learned some new tips and tools to build really meaningful and lasting relationships at work. Thank you so much, everyone.